Now, former VBS Chief Financial Officer Phillip Truter has been released on parole. Truter was sentenced to 7 years for his involvement in the VBS looting scandal. His release comes after the sentencing of former chairperson Chipiwa Matodzi. He was sentenced to 15 years in jail. Let's discuss this further, including the conditions of Truter's parole. We're joined this afternoon by spokesperson for the Department of Correctional Services, Singabakho Nxumalo. Great to talk to you as always, sir. Thanks very much indeed for giving us your time. The first man to be sentenced, and now the first person to be out on parole. The timing is ironic, isn't it? Just given the fact that Matodzi has just received his 15-year sentence last week.
A very good day, and thank you for having us. One can't say much in terms of how the prosecution is handling the matter, working together with the police. But with regard to Correctional Services, Mr. Phillip Truter was admitted after that the conviction, and he then started serving the sentence. He was given the 10-year sentence, but 3 years suspended for a period of 5 years, meaning that he had to serve a 7-year term. And he did serve the sentence after reaching the minimum detention period. As per Section 73 of the Correctional Services Act, he was then considered for parole. And eventually the parole board did place him out on the 12th of April 2024. Yeah,
so the minimum term that he would have served would have been 50%, is that correct? Half of the sentence when you become eligible for parole. Yes. But he also benefit from the remission of sentence.
That would be 3 years and 6 months. That he would have reached on the 6th of April 2024. And yes, he did benefit from the special remission of sentence, but that was very minimal. He only benefited by 2 months, so it didn't really count much. But it did assist him in terms of what is left of the entire sentence, as the sentence that was given, the 7 years, will expire on the 6th of October 2025. So currently he is being monitored by community corrections officials because there are conditions attached to that parole placement.
Yeah, it's very interesting because parole doesn't have to be granted, right? Just because you become eligible for parole, it doesn't mean that you'll be approved to be a parolee effectively. What are some of the considerations when the parole board makes a decision of this nature? And the fact that this was corruption, the charges he faced included corruption, fraud, racketeering and money laundering. He received kickbacks to the value of 5 million rand. So with that background in mind for our viewers, give us what would have been the considerations, as far as you know, for this parole decision.
I'm happy you are raising that point, because many people often think that parole is something that is automatic, guaranteed. It has to be given at whatever cost, which is not the case. Parole placement is earned, meaning that it is something that is built within an inmate's journey towards rehabilitation. When inmates come into our facilities, when being admitted, we throw what we call a correctional sentence plan. That's when inmates are assessed. And you admit a person today, within 21 days, you have to complete that assessment and then throw what we then call the correctional sentence plan. In that correctional sentence plan, you will then shout the programs that ought to assist this person towards the rehabilitation process. And in that, you'll also factor in when one is due to be considered for parole. I want to emphasize the word considered, because it doesn't mean that once you've reached the minimum detention period, automatically you are placed out. You ought to be considered. Hence, we have Correctional Supervision and Parole Board, and these are independent structures. They then take the correctional sentence plan vis-a-vis the reports detailing the life of this person. Hence, we call it an offender profile, and check whether the person has completed all the programs and look at those assessment reports. And if a person is deemed to be ready to be placed out, meaning back into the community, they will then make that specific decision. And then a person will be given the date. There will also be a pre-release program. So it's correct. Serving half of the sentence doesn't mean that automatically you go out. You still have to be considered. So even with this particular case, Mr. Phillip Truter was considered, and the parole board deemed that he was fit to be placed out. Hence, you then find there are conditions attached to that parole placement.
And I imagine it'll be harder to convince the parole board that you do qualify for parole, depending on the seriousness of your crime. So murder, for example, rape, and the like.
And that journey towards rehabilitation is a tool that is being used, meaning that the correctional sentence plan details exactly when are you due to participate in what programs. And they will also provide space for assessment reports by our specialists. So here I'm referring to your psychologists, criminologists, social workers. They also do their assessments to say, this person having completed the following programs, and in terms of our assessments, this is what we picked up. Those specialists, they will even place that even if this person has completed these programs, there is still room for improvement, or they will recommend that other programs also be attended so that we assist this individual, because the objective of a Department of Correctional Services is to correct the wrong and prepare a person for a life post-incarceration. So if a person is not ready, the specialist will say so, and the parole board will indeed state that, look, at this point, you are not yet ready. Go participate in the following programs and then come back, so that we can then make a decision whether indeed you are now ready. Because you have to make it a point that you do not place a person out that still carries a risk that this person may reoffend, or this person may still cause harm to society. Hence, then the process even differs when you compare to people given determined sentences and those who are given life sentences. For lifers, it's even more rigorous. Mm-hmm. But as a department, we have to make it a point that we follow Section 73 in terms of what is to be done, and even for an inmate also to recognize that what I did was wrong. I've served the time. I'm now a rehabilitated person because I've benefited from those rehabilitation programs, but also how do we then prepare this person for life post-incarceration?
Right. Mr. Nxumalo, I haven't heard you talk about the victim at all in this process.
What you then find in the rehabilitation journey and the parole processes, the victim participation is built in it. So then they will then try to say, okay, who is the perpetrator and who is the victim? But what you then find in cases mostly that involve fraud, you'll find that if it is an institution which is a victim, they will decide whether they will want to come forward or not. It often works much easier if, let's say, you can direct to an individual being a victim of crime, because you then reach out to that individual to say, the person that violated you is going through rehabilitation, and at some point will want you to start participating in what we call victim offender mediation and victim offender dialogue, where people get to meet face to face. And it is a process which is more about restorative justice, to say perhaps in future those people can find one another. Whether they forgive each other is a different matter, but it's important that a perpetrator does take a recognition and does admit to say, what I did was wrong, I did cause harm to someone, and then to say, I'm willing to make amends for that. So
and was that done in this case? Was that done in this case? The elderly people who invested their life savings in VBS Mutual Bank, were they consulted, do you think?
So with this particular case, the perpetrator is Ms. Phillip Truter, but then here the institution listed as the victim is VBS. Then it's a matter of saying, then how is then that constituted to say, then what are the boundaries in terms of who do we then get people in as individuals that invested their monies as victims, or you take institution VBS as the victim?
I mean, I feel like the answer is a simple one, right? It should be the people who were impacted. So in short, your answer to whether the victims were consulted at all or had any part in this parole process, the answer would be no.
In this case, it will be the institution as VBS, because you didn't have individuals listed as people who were victims in this case. As the case goes before court, you will have the perpetrator and those who were at the receiving end. So if those people say, let's say, were listed there to say these are the people affected by the case, you will then have to make it a point that those people get to be contacted. But when you deal with an institution, it is that institution that must come forward representing those victims.
And do you think that this was a miscarriage of justice? The fact that these very real victims and people, these individuals who lost their life savings, these people who sat outside VBS Mutual Bank night after night trying to withdraw the little that they could, do you think this was a miscarriage of justice that they were not even considered as someone to consult?
Then Correctional Services' parameters are clear here. Ours, you get a warrant of detention to say, here's a person sentenced for this particular offense. This is the person that must be taken through rehabilitation processes. And once that person has served that required time, in terms of to say then how do you then start engaging with then the victim, you then go back to that warrant, who is listed there? You have an institution. So that's what you need to deal with. So if perhaps then one will say, okay, let's take it even much further than that. Unfortunately, Correctional Services will not go into that because the documentation before us does not say so. It's a different case when you have everyone listed there to say, here listed below are the victims. But if it says the victim here is an institution, you ought to deal with that particular institution.
So there's no burden on even the parole board to know enough about this case of Truter versus VBS Mutual Bank. There's no burden on the parole board to say, no, hang on a second. The victim here is not an institution. The victims are real people who have had their lives ruined. There's no burden on the parole board to do that?
What is before you? Unfortunately, you've got to limit yourself with what is before you. Otherwise, you'll then start going to areas where you find that one, you've got an expertise, or you may fall short. Deal with what is before you. There are various players within the criminal justice system, and each of those players have a particular responsibility. You wouldn't want Correctional Services now start going into prosecuting people or even going further now to say, how does the police conduct their work? So it's important that we deal with the business of corrections. And then here the objective is clear. It says Correctional Services correct what is wrong with people who are brought before you, prepare them for life post their incarceration. And there's a process of restorative justice where then you have to make means where the perpetrator and the victim find ways to reach out and see if perhaps out of that process, you could make something out of it. So as a department, then we can't then say, okay, now let's take this thing to another level. Let's look, and you will be then, stretching yourself into areas that you may find that going to that level may also prove to be challenging.
Singabakho Nxumalo is the spokesperson for Correctional Services. If you've been listening to the story and you have some perspective, an opinion on whether you think this is in fact justice, do let us know at Newzroom 405 is our X handle. The responsibility of Correctional Services is to prepare the incarcerated for life post-incarceration. I wonder how the VBS Mutual Bank victims are preparing for their lives post this incarceration.